You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 404 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm covering a lot of the protest movements and peace talks going on around the world. Protests in Hong Kong, Iraq, Ecuador, U.S. North Korean talks, possibly four-party talks involving Ukraine, Taliban U.S. talks. So I'll discuss, the possibilities of these actually amounting to something and just all the news going on with foreign policy, as always. So share the show at libertarianinstitute.org. On the homepage there, you find the show and the daily news roundup that I write. Be sure to subscribe to the show somewhere, wherever your favorite podcatcher is. The show will be up there. And while you're there, give me a rating and review. And last, if you want to be a donor to the show, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Monday, October 15th, 9 p.m. Eastern Time is the upcoming October live stream that I'm doing. All right, so the first thing I have on today's show is actually a little bit of a correction. In the past, I believe on the show, I have mentioned that the Dallas policewoman, her name is Amber Geiger, who shot the guy after she went in his apartment. I either said that she was definitely going to get off or that she already had. Well, that's wrong. She was actually convicted and is going to spend 10 years in prison, probably closer to 5, which is the minimum. But I was very surprised that the jury did find her guilty. And I guess, it's worth saying that maybe, while Dallas, I'm sure, is a little bit more liberal than rural Texas, all the same within Texas, you did find a police officer guilty of a murder. Now, I guess we got to qualify that with, she was off duty and this guy, I think was like in pajamas eating cereal on his couch when she walked into his apartment and shot him. But all the same, it is important that the people of this country are willing to question the murder when it happens, of our state appointed authority figures like cops. And a couple of stories on the Pentagon. One, and I'll link to this one in the show notes page. A Pentagon employee says that he was forced out. So I guess they transferred him and kind of made the environment uncomfortable until he left, because he was trying to blow the whistle on overbilling by U.S. defense contractors. So let's say that Lockheed Martin is, selling like 3 plane engines to the United States. It should cost like $195 million and they round up to $200 million. Or, say everything costs a little bit more than it should. And, the U.S. ends up getting overcharged or maybe, not refunding entire, things if the product's defective or something like that. Anyways, it amounts to a couple $100 million over 5 years. And that's, just what this one guy has identified. But, nobody wants to hear it. The number in the article is 900 million to 600 million. And then the reason I really want to talk about on the show is this quote from this Pentagon official who says, well, if you think about it, over that amount of time, we're going to spend X trillions of dollars. So, overpaying by $6 to $9 million, $900 million is like, 0.2% of that total amount. And, I say that's a pretty good rate of mistakes and throwing money away. And that's kind of jaw-dropping because it's like, oh my God, just a small fraction, 0.2% of that $600 million would be life-changing, in my life, but also pretty much anybody I know. That, very small fraction, that amount of money would absolutely change their life in so many ways that I think it shows how far removed from reality the people at the Pentagon are when they, deal with the, these dollars that they don't even know what that money would mean to somebody else, that they are just knowingly throwing away. And not only are they throwing it away, they're saying that, we're throwing away and it doesn't matter that we're doing it. We're doing a good job even though we're losing this money. So the Pentagon has now taken over doing, I guess, the background checks and approving of security clearances for 95% of government personnel. I think it was the Chinese that hacked the agency and got the records and information of all these people who had applied for, government security clearances. And, I'm not sure if this is going to make a huge difference, but it does seem like quite a bit more power for the Pentagon in deciding what is or is not acceptable to give you security clearance. Again, that article will be linked in the show notes page. Customs and Border Patrol is going to spend $1.2 million on an anti-drone system for the southern border. I guess what this system is, and they're going to have 6 of them, I think mile and a half range, like kind of a bubble around this little like station that they put up. And so, within this bubble, if a drone flies in, the system somehow it hats into the drone, I'm guessing, through frequency jamming and whatever, and gets the drone to like just ram itself into the ground. Kind of curious as to why they want these systems. Are they concerned about people maybe trying to get photographic evidence of stuff the Customs and Border Patrol are doing? Are maybe migrants revolutionizing what they're doing a little bit? Or drug smugglers and, flying little drones over the border, see if there's anybody around, and then crossing the border in, whatever way that they're doing that, whether it's river or climbing a fence or underground. I don't know. But, this seems to me one of those things that should require like some congressional debate if we're deploying anti-drone systems on our southern border, because, realistically, it could prevent Americans from using drones for their own purposes too. Let's say if I were a journalist and I was curious as to what, the Customs and Border Patrol do along the border, and I go up there with a little drone and fly that around to maybe, try to catch or report on any malfeasance. Well, now that's, disabled here too. The brother of the Honduran president, the brother is Tony Hernandez, is on trial in New York now for drug smuggling. I guess this guy was just pretty blatant and brazen about it, talking about how, he was involved in drug smuggling, and I guess even like putting his initials on the packages that were being delivered. And maybe it's not true to that extent, but that is something that's been reported about this guy. But anyways, he's on trial in New York. Now, of course, the brother claims I had nothing to do with it, and I think gets along pretty well with the United States. This is the president of Honduras. But, it's quite obvious that he was probably involved in his brother's corruption, yet he's not going to get tied up in it at all. It just kind of reminds you of, things that happened in Afghanistan, like the brother of the U.S. bad president of Afghanistan, Wali Karzai, being a major drug smuggler. Elsewhere in Latin America, you have protests going on in Haiti trying to force out the president there. Those protests seem to be pretty brutal clashes between the police and the protesters. Now, I don't follow this closely enough, so I can't say for sure if it's getting better or worse, more serious, less serious. But this has been going on for a while, and it either gets just reported on very sparsely, or like, it ramps up for a week and then it slows back down for a couple weeks, and then there's major clashes again, stuff like that. In Ecuador, there's been several protests against the government there for, I think, government austerity reforms that may be a part of the IMF loans that they're receiving. It's like $2 million. People are upset about increasing food prices and the loss of fuel subsidies. Now, of course, as I am a libertarian, I am not for government, welfare handouts at all. But at the same time, Ecuador is a country with an awful lot of corruption and, people stealing the wealth that, is supposed to go to the collective group of the people. So, there is a reason for the people of Ecuador to be very upset about this. So far, I think 370 protesters have been arrested. So with North Korea, I'll go ahead and start with, I think probably the last story that I haven't covered. And that is the United States was saying that they were going to have talks with North Korea. And North Korea tested a submarine-launched ballistic missile. Just to update, the response to the United States to that missile test was like, you're kind of bordering now on pushing the envelope too far here. And, kind of breaking the freeze for freeze status that's going on between the U.S. and North Korea. I was worried that might scuttle the planned talks in Sweden. They're supposed to start October 5th, but they went ahead anyways. The talks happened, and then at least the reports from the North Korean side is it did not go well. The North Koreans say that the Americans offered nothing new and that they were done with talks. So, that looks like some bad news. Very unfortunate that something didn't happen there. I think a lot of us were optimistic that with Bolton being gone, this was a place that the president was going to be able to maybe make a little headway, try to rope in a quick foreign policy success by making some kind of even small but workable deal with Kim Jong-un. But from what we're hearing from the Korean side, it sounds like the U.S. offered the same thing as before, which is North Korea must unilaterally denuclearize before the United States begins starting sanctions, removing sanctions, which North Korea is looking for a more step-by-step process. So a few stories on China here. China displayed some weapons at the 70th anniversary of their country. I guess that's when Mao officially took over the Communist Party dictatorship there. And, military parade, they had a whole bunch of weapons in the street. Some of these weapons are new, more advanced cruise missile, I think hypersonic cruise missiles is how the way to say it. Missiles capable of flying very fast, very far, and carrying 10 nuclear warheads, and then also upgraded submarines and possibly a bomber. And so saw some reporting that said that, hey, this looks like China now has a more advanced nuclear triad, making a real step forward there. And so, it's important to remember that while the U.S. thinks, we could bully anybody in the world, and that certainly seems to be Donald Trump's position on China, we'll just, continue this economic warfare and pushing the limits and boundaries by selling Taiwan more weapons, sailing our warships through Taiwan Strait and around different areas in the South China Sea. But, China does have very real deterrents. In Hong Kong, protests there continue and definitely becoming more violent. This is kind of what I talked about, I believe, on Monday's show last week, saying that I have felt like definitely the protesters had become more and more provocative. And now the police had taken a shot at a protester, hit him in the shoulder. I don't think that person ended up dying. But then the government started to enact emergency powers, and I think making a mistake here, going the wrong direction with it. So one of the things I guess that was changed was the phrasing of the police mission. Whereas before, I guess the police could be held accountable for their actions of beating protesters. Far more likely than it, at least in the wording of the document, it was kind of like if the police went too far, they were individually accountable. Whereas now it's going to be police have the authority to carry out the orders they're given or something along those lines. So that looked unfortunate to me, the way that the law would be changing. The government tried to ban face masks, I guess that way they could actually see the people who are, causing all the rioting and stuff like that. And of course, as the people are afraid of it, it's going to expose them. The government's going to be able to document everybody who's at one of these protests. Yeah, I'm really concerned that at this point, the Hong Kong protests are kind of stuck in a cycle where they could get more and more violent, kind of on each side here until something, bad happens and the United States tries to get very involved. So hopefully, somebody there will back down. Going to Ukraine, I guess President Zelensky, the leader of Ukraine and who has, I believe the support of the Ukrainian parliament in a pretty large majority, is looking to have four-party talks with Ukraine and Russia, and I believe 2 European countries, France and Germany, also involved, to find some kind of conclusion to the Ukrainian civil war. And I believe he, floated the possibility of allowing autonomy to the Donbass region. So that's a separatist-held region in Russia, in eastern Ukraine that borders Russia. And, these people are very much more pro-Russian. So when you had the 2014 U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine and a much more Western government thrown in place that, wanted to join NATO, wanted to kick Russia out of their naval base in Crimea. I believe they banned Russian as an official language and other things, took other real steps against a very large segment of the Ukrainian population, which is ethnically, I think culturally still very Russian. It really disenfranchised them to the point where the people of Crimea were just like, hey, we'd rather join Russia than be a part of a Ukraine like this. And so they voted in favor of it, and, Russia just annexed them, and that was that. And in this eastern Ukraine, a civil war broke out, killing, 13,000 people, I believe. And now there's a region known as the Donbass that's still held by separatists. So while there is a ceasefire, the Minsk II in place that has, stopped what could be a very explosive war from happening all the time, there are pretty frequent ceasefire violations there. And it now seems that there's a possibility to end it, and Zelensky would be willing possibly to take some big steps to make that happen. All right, so this discussion on Turkey is going to be a little bit longer just because there's so much going on with Turkey. Of course, I'll just start off by saying that Turkey is a NATO ally of the United States, as is Greece, but Turkey has conflicts with two U.S. allies, one being Greece as a NATO ally, and then the other one being the Syrian YPG, which was the U.S. allies during the fight against ISIS in eastern Syria. The U.S. and Turkey also have had a somewhat strained relationship because Turkey decided to buy the S-400 missile defense system from Russia rather than buying the U.S.-made Patriot missile system. This caused the United States to kick Turkey out of the F-35 project and refuse to sell them any of those warplanes. And so there's other things going on outside of the two issues we'll talk about a little bit more on today's show, but I just wanted to, try to put everything in context here. So Cyprus is a country that I honestly don't know enough about, but there is a, population kind of split there between, I guess, people of Greek descent and people of Turkish descent, and that caused some fracturing and issues within Cyprus and has led to conflicts between Greece and Turkey for other issues as well. There's conflict between those two countries. But I think it's a lot of territorial type issues that create problems at this point. But Turkey has been drilling for oil, I believe already in disputed areas, but in a more, I guess, location that Turkey could claim is maybe theirs. And now they're going to start drilling for oil in a location that seems to be pretty clearly not a place that Turkey should be drilling for oil. Greece protested, and, I guess Mike Pompeo was going through Eastern Europe, making stops in North Macedonia, as well as maybe Montenegro, another NATO member state, and told Pompeo that, hey, you have to stop Turkey from doing this. Pompeo said that it was unacceptable and illegal for Turkey to drill for oil here. I'm not confident that's going to get Turkey to stop. The show is being released on October 7th, and that is the date that Erdogan says the drilling will start. All right, now if you head to the other side of Turkey, you get Turkish Kurdistan, and on the other side of the Syrian border there is Syrian Kurdistan. The Syrian Kurds are basically the ethnic group and their militia, the YPG, that the U.S. used to fight against the Islamic State east of the Euphrates River in Syria, and now the Syrian Kurds control most of that territory. Well, Turkey views the Turkish and the Syrian Kurds as terrorists of one group and has, throughout the U.S. backing of the Syrian Kurds, constantly complained about it and said how, dangerous it was and how problematic for them it was. The U.S. has made promises and, to be honest, failed short on almost all of them. The Syrian Kurds still control a little bit of territory west of the Euphrates River, which Turkey has consistently demanded that the U.S. do something about. The U.S. has said, okay, we will, and then really hasn't. The U.S. has also said they'll take back all their weapons from the Syrian Kurds once they're done, but that doesn't seem to be happening at all either, and is probably not even possible. So Turkey's new demand is that there is a safe zone established along the Syrian-Turkish border, but within Syria, that's 20 to 30 kilometers deep, all the way from the Euphrates to the Iraqi border. So you may have to look up a map to get an idea of what this area is going to be like. And then Turkey is going to settle 2 million Syrian Arab, so now the same ethnic group as the Syrian Kurds, within that territory. I think that would be massively problematic for a very long time. Maybe, hundreds of years from now, still dealing with, kind of the ethnic tensions and the issues of putting all those Syrian Arabs there. So I really hope that doesn't happen. And, Turkey also has a large chunk of Syria held that I think is somewhat mixed, but a lot more Syrian Arab land. This is a chunk of Syria, I think in the northern Aleppo province, from Afrin all the way to pretty much where the Syrian Kurds take control near the Euphrates River. And if they really were just concerned about resettling the Syrian refugees, it seems like it would be a lot safer, for the Syrian Arabs to, be within land that's mostly Syrian Arab. And at the same time, you don't have to deal with the fact that the Syrian Kurds are going to feel like you're trying to basically displace and cleanse them from the area, which is going to provoke probably an insurgency. The U.S. has said that, okay, we'll help you set this up. But other than a couple joint patrols, it seems pretty half-hearted. Erdogan said that at any time, Turkey could start now the offensive to clear this area and create the safe zone. So imagine, if you're a Syrian Kurd right now, probably looking at this and reading the news saying that he's calling it a safe zone, and the U.S. is kind of going along with the idea that this would be a safe zone. But to, establish the safe zone, they're going to come in with their military. It's just such a joke. The Syrian Kurds say they will treat an invasion, by Turkey in this area with all-out war. And that seems like, since there's still some U.S. troops there, that's going to be a pretty complicated situation for the U.S. So I'm sure that, this is going to continue to be a subject on shows to come. But this is really an important issue going on here in Syria and around Cyprus. In Iraq, protests have now killed at least 88 people. They started Tuesday last week, and that 88 figure is through Saturday. Patrick Coburn has been in Baghdad for a few days before the protests started, and so has been reporting from there all week, doing an excellent job. First talking about the lieutenant general who commanded the counterterrorism forces, and I guess in Iraq is known somewhat of a hero in the 2017 battle for Mosul against ISIS. Seeing a guy that liberated that city, and I guess by comparative standards to the rest of the Shia militias and Iraqi army, was less corrupt and brutal and, just generally not as much of a war criminal as the rest of them, or at least that's how he's portrayed. So the government and the prime minister there reassigns him from that force that he was on that liberated Mosul to, I guess, some nothing job in their defense ministry. And along with that said, hey, Iraq right now looks pretty fragile and there's some stability there, but the U.S. and Iran are both trying to exert influence, and the long-term stability there, very fragile and very dangerous. Well, a couple days later, protests start breaking out, and it doesn't seem, at least so far, I haven't seen, people crying out the name of the lieutenant general. So that probably wasn't the straw. But rather, as Patrick Coburn has reported since he has been there, the overreaction to the Iraqi security forces of the protests. So small protests have been going on in Iraq for a while, much like in Ecuador, around kind of raising prices, the government promising all of this. They have all this oil revenue that's coming in, a lot of it just being stolen, all the corruption that goes on. And yeah, the next politician says they're going to fix it, and they never do. And, it's just kind of like American politics, except the people there are really suffering. They don't have jobs. There's not a way to get jobs. They don't have money. There's no, subsidies, or not enough subsidies for fuel and food and stuff like that. So, it's just a miserable life. And so there's always people out there protesting. But one day the security forces overreacted and killed a couple people. And then from then on out, it seems like it was pretty much on. A couple observations that I've read both, in Coburn and then other reporting on this. The protest movement is somewhat not centralized, at least through the weekend. Moqtada Sadr, who is one of the most prominent Shia clerics in Iraq and one of the, I think, greatest political influencers, you would say, has not directly kind of gotten involved in support the protest or have, tried to co-opt the movement. I guess nobody else really has either. Everybody's pointing out that these are in Shia areas of Iraq. And so it's not necessarily like the Sunni or the Kurds protesting the Shia government. It's the Shia protesting the Shia government. So after, kind of the first day of protests where a couple people were killed, they start to get bigger and the security forces start to use more and more force. To the point, this is across several cities, that 88 people have died This is from Tuesday through Saturday, so that's like 5 days of protest. And the government hasn't done a whole lot, I see, to try to at least quell the protest by making any kind of concessions. They just kind of generally say, oh, we're going to look into the corruption. But I'm sure that people are tired of hearing that. Apparently, we nearly had a phone call between Trump and Rouhani last week. I guess that would have been early last week. But it was very unfortunate that Trump continues to say that we want more sanctions against Iran. And so the phone call didn't happen. I think this would have, at least for Rouhani and the Iran, be seen as a concession. They're saying they're not going to talk to Trump until the sanctions are lifted and the U.S. returns to the JCPOA, which they got out of first. And now Iran is, been walking back some of the concessions that they made within the JCPOA, but still well within the NPT and obviously not on a path to making nuclear weapons. But, this possible call that I think really Macron has been leading, the French president leading to try to set up some kind of deal between Iran and the U.S. to either re-enter the JCPOA or come to another similar agreement, just so everybody could get back to business with Iran and Iran could get back in compliance with, all the limitations set within the JCPOA, and we could get past this whole fake pretense of war and all these tensions going on in the Persian Gulf that I'm sure, is bad for everyone's business. But, so I guess, the call maybe happens. Macron is telling Rouhani, oh yeah, Trump's on board with this thing that somehow was going to get him to ease sanctions. And then Trump goes out 2 times within 24 hours and say, I want to put more sanctions on Iran. And Rouhani heard that and said, I'm not getting on board with this. And that was the end of that. I've seen a couple sources report that Saudi Arabia is interested in a ceasefire agreement, at least a limited one with the Houthis in Yemen. I haven't seen many details of that, but recently the Houthis have proposed an agreement where Saudi stops bombing Yemen and in exchange, the Houthis stop attacking Saudi Arabia. I'm sure I'll have more on that in the week to come, especially if those talks are developing somewhere. And last story on today's show, in Egypt, protests going on there against the military dictator al-Sisi. Of course, he's one of the U.S.-backed dictators, but he's been pretty brutal in his suppression of his opposition, and this continues. 2,000 protesters wrapped up in, I think, about a week's time span. All right, everybody, that's it for the show. Please share foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, at KYAAALE on Twitter. Foreign Policy Focus is the name of the Facebook group, and patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.